Living in Switzerland and Brussels, in Belgium, and very simply I worked for Royal Dutch Shell headquartered in London, and then I moved to a job in Switzerland for the World Economic Forum, and I stayed on in Switzerland consulting and working.
But you have lived in Europe, in US as well?
I studied in the US at Stanford University and lived in California. I do a lot of work in the US, but predominantly I'm a European.
European?
Yes. And I've worked in Australia, I've worked in Asia.
You were in Africa as well? South Africa?
I've been to South Africa, I've worked, but not for long periods, but I traveled to South Africa.
So you have been pretty much in every continent?
Well, I'm old enough to travel to lots of places.
Okay. And you pick up Switzerland. Why? Why do you work?
Because that's the headquarters of the company I worked for.
Ah, okay. It's not that you found that country particularly...
Well, it's a small country. It actually has some elements of Peru. I like mountains. I like walking. It's got beautiful lakes. It's a pleasant environment. It's central. It's easy. Its airports are accessible. Its public system, public transport is excellent. Mm-hmm. We like it. My wife enjoys it. Strange, but it's boring, and it's a little bit parochial. The cities are small. If you're born in and grew up in a place like London, London.
So you're London.
I'm a London.
Oh, okay.
London Lima has elements of London. It's a city that's spread out. Of course, London goes high. We don't have the earthquake issues. But London is enormous. I mean, you can throw 3 Switzerlands into London.
Yeah, and you have everything there, like people from all around the world and so on.
I like it. I think it's an exciting environment, interesting environment.
Great. So you have been brought here to Peru for a specific issue, right, or a specific event?
I came here for this event that Foro had been organizing. In fact, I think. There are involved in there 3 events, mm-hmm. Of which today's event was around IPA and its innovation program. And yes, I think they've organized it extremely well. What they've done is to arrange a group of people to come here and really contribute to a number of different events.
And have you had the opportunity to look around Lima? You went to Miraflores, you were saying?
Yes, I mean, my wife has probably seen more of Lima than I have, but we do what tourists do. We went on a tour, we went out to the Musée Lampo, and we're off for a week, so we fly to Cusco.
You have been
tomorrow?
Cusco?
No, we go tomorrow morning
you're going
to Cusco,
to fly.
And then straight out to Urubamba, and then to do what tourists do, Machu Picchu, and then back into Cusco, and then back into Lima.
And then back to Switzerland to continue working? Or?
No, actually we fly to Brussels, but then I fly 2 days later out to Rio de Janeiro.
Oh, okay.
For the Rio +20 meeting.
Oh, right. That's pretty much coming very soon.
Yeah.
Okay, and what about you have been working in Shell for a while, right?
Quite a while.
Quite a while.
I worked in Shell just over 30 years.
And then you were pretty much involved in scenario planning, right?
The key thread of my work is scenario planning. I was, and more strictly, the global business environment, so everything to do with issues around the business environment. So economics, politics.
So can you explain, broadly, what scenario planning is? Like in plain words,
Yeah. Well, I think very simply. When we look out to the world, and particularly if we're dealing with any activity of substance, we have an ambition for it. But we're not quite sure how the world will develop. Okay. So the question is, how do we handle that uncertainty? At a minimum, one needs to identify ideally the risks that we face, because it's those risks that we try to protect ourselves against. Mm-hmm. The scenario planning is a structured approach to understanding those risks, and it provides information about sort of worlds we're And you can ask simple questions. How will my project operate in that world? How will my company fare? And that interrogation of the future allows you to consider actions in the present. So that the whole function of looking at it is simply to come back with that knowledge and ask yourself, does that affect what I do and how I do it?
So you are looking into the future to...
You're trying to understand, to be frank, you're trying to understand the forces that shape the future. Why do I put it in those terms? It's simply because I don't believe we can forecast the future, but there are some aspects of the future we have a much better understanding of than others. If you look at 4 or 5 years and say you were a marketer, at least you probably have a reasonable idea of the demography of the country, its structure of consumption. But you may be unsure about many other things. The nature of competition 3 years out, the governments may change a regulation. There may be competitors from abroad you didn't expect. There may be all sorts of things which you have to cope with. So it's a way of handling the inherent uncertainty we live with in the world. And being prepared. And in life, in many areas, you don't have to be right about the future. You have to be more right than your competitors.
Oh, okay. But I mean, you're trying to understand what the factors are that are shaping
Very
things.
much so.
And there are some factors that you get to understand, and there are others that you are not being able. So you treat them in probability terms.
I don't use probabilities, but there are some things I'm reasonably sure about.
Okay.
And there are other things that I'm not sure about. In fact, there are other things which I would say nobody knows the answer to. If you really work in areas that are at the level of a country or about the planet, they're just simply things we don't know the answer to. So, and in life, preparation has a value.
But it's interesting to what you're saying, that you don't work with probability.
Because I know that there are millions of futures that are possible out there. So I'm more interested in doing a number of things when I understand the futures. One is, how do I prepare myself possibly for different worlds? Mm-hmm. Secondly, it may be that in some areas I want to create something. If you want to create something in the world, there's no point in talking about probabilities. You need to understand the sort of pathways that are possible that will lead to success.
Yeah, but if you understand what's more probable, maybe...
Well, I would use words like plausible.
Oh, okay.
Is something plausible? Is it possible? So there are tests of plausibility and possibility, but that doesn't mean I have to assign a probability.
So what's the difference between probability and plausibility?
I think in the case of plausible, for me it would mean that it could exist in the future given certain conditions. So what interests me is the conditions which lead to something happening.
So it's a scenario that you have to be aware of.
It has to have some test of reason.
Mm-hmm.
I think reason is valuable. I believe rigor in analysis is important.
Okay.
So when I lay out a future, I want to be sure that it could happen. Not that it will happen or must happen, but it could happen. But as I say, there are many possible futures, so it's not really clever to say, I think there's a 60% chance of this and 40% chance of that. I'm dealing with many, many more things than just...
Okay, and how much of your work is mathematical? I mean, when you are talking about plausibility and scenario planning, is there some math there involved, or it's more about...
Well, in depending on the area, I mean, there are many aspects of the future that mathematics will not help you. The nature of the government will be in power, the values that people hold. I mean, there's just a whole set of issues which are qualitative rather than quantitative.
Mm-hmm.
But there are some that are very quantitative. If you're doing work now around climate change or energy futures or the economy, these are quantified, and they're quantified in part because the way many people address these issues is in terms of quantities. It's in terms of growth rates, or it's in terms of energy consumption, or it's in terms of CO2 production. So yes, I think to be able to engage in discussion and dialogue in these areas, you need to have you need to quantify. Quantification provides a discipline. It's an important discipline which forces you to examine the way drivers of the future lead to outcomes in the future. It is clearly not a science in the full sense, but then nothing that matters in the world is just a science. And even if you take the climate change issue, the physics and chemistry of climate change are very much based on scientific hypotheses, in my view, fairly well thought through. But even science is open to change. So, the story of science, I use the ideas of Karl Popper here, which is science, what we currently call known science, and the theories of science are just the ones we've yet to disprove. And it's the nature of science you're continually disproving, or we could say improving, on the hypothesis. They give us greater insight into the way the world goes.
And Popper also talked about the discussion, right? How important is discussion?
I think discussion is extremely important. So it's let's say, ideally it's the dialogue around competing hypotheses and the processes for selection of hypotheses, which is extremely important. These are important processes. But science is very important in some ways. Let's say physics and chemistry, climate change. When it comes to the issues of how a government should act in the face of possible future events, well, then it's more complex. It's got to do with values, the priorities in the government, the options. Is it a country that has adaptation options and other options and not just mitigation options? It's a more complex and correctly more complex political debate, and of which economics plays an important role because the costs are an important aspect in the final decision. Governments in the end, companies as well, individuals, of course, have to make choice under rules of scarcity. So,
Are you an economist?
I trained as an economist at the London School of Economics. What you study is not what you end up knowing, because you have in between 30 years, which is covering a wide range of things, including social issues, political issues. Much of what shapes decision making is not just the simple calculation of the engineering and even the economics. In many cases, the most fundamental drivers going forward are probably social and technological, because they have the capacity to completely change the nature of the thing. And in that sense, engineering and economics is somewhat derivative of these changes that take place.
What about the rule of 7? I have read something about that.
Well, I think, this is really when you are a practitioner in any area, you end up with rules of thumb. The reality is that many people, when they hear about scenarios, focus on the horizon. They say, well, how can it be useful if you look 20 years ahead, 20-year scenarios? I think they miss the point that the point of doing any work, scenarios included, is to try to affect decision-making and policy in the short term. You have a fairly limited time horizon of usability of this work. I tend to think of it rather like tomatoes. If you leave the tomato out for too long, it'll die. They perish. Scenarios are perishable. And the law of 7 essentially is a rule of thumb that says if you're looking out for scenarios for 20 years ahead, they probably will not be usable much after 3 years, which is 1/7 of the length of the horizon. If you're looking at scenarios out over 50 years, they're probably going to be remade every 8 years or so. And that, in fact, you take, for example, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change work, scenario sets are probably reviewed, they look out 50 years, every 8 years. In Shell, the 20-year scenarios were reviewed approximately every 3 years. And I found that very useful. I've done many projects. It's a very useful thing to remind yourself. When you do work, any work is meant to shape, debate, discussion, dialogue in the present, that it has a limited life. So focus on the needs of that area of dialogue in the shorter